somewhere in the dark about 100 meters below the surface, past tunnels that no sunlight has ever touched, a team of researchers found something that didn't make sense. Not a tool, not a piece of pottery, not the kind of thing you'd expect to pull out of the earth and immediately understand. What they found was a species, or something close to one, something that looked, in certain ways, unmistakably human, and in other ways like nothing we've ever put a name to. And the deeper scientists looked, the stranger it got. Here's the central problem. We think we know what humans are. We think we know what our relatives were, who came before us, how they lived, how they thought, how they moved through the world. We've built entire fields of science around that assumption. Paleoanthropology, archaeology, genetics. Yeah, millions of hours of work, thousands of papers, decades of fieldwork across 4 continents, and then a cave hands us something that quietly contradicts almost all of it. This species doesn't fit the timeline, it doesn't fit the geography, it doesn't fit the behavioural profile we've assigned to human relatives at this stage of evolution. It's like finding a chapter in a book you thought you'd already finished reading. So today, there are 3 questions driving everything that follows. What exactly was found down there, and why did it take so long to find it? How did this species actually live? What did it eat? What did it make? What did it know? And what does its existence mean for the story we tell about ourselves, about where we came from and what made us human in the first place? Before we get there, it's worth thinking about why caves matter so much in this field. They're not just dramatic backdrops for discovery, they're archives. Stone doesn't rot. Darkness slows decay. Caves are chemically stable in ways that open landscapes simply aren't. Bones that would dissolve in a rainforest floor in a few thousand years can survive hundreds of thousands of years inside the right chamber, under the right sediment, in the right conditions. When scientists want to find evidence of ancient life, they don't always go looking in the obvious places. They go looking where preservation was possible. And more often than not, that means going underground. Which makes it even more striking that this particular cave kept its secret for so long. It wasn't undiscovered. People knew it was there, they'd been inside, but the evidence was buried deep. And it took the right moment, the right tools, and maybe a little luck to finally pull it into the light. If you're listening to this right now, whether you're falling asleep, commuting, studying, or just lying in the dark somewhere wondering about the world, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. It genuinely surprises me every time I check. People from completely different corners of the planet, all sitting with the same question at the same moment. That alone says something interesting about us. Now let's talk about what was found. The cave sits in a region that most maps don't make look interesting. No dramatic peaks nearby, no famous river, no reason for a traveller to stop and think, there's probably something worth investigating underground here. It's the kind of landscape that gets crossed rather than explored, and that, as it turns out, is exactly why it stayed quiet for so long. Cave systems like this one form over millions of years. Water finds the weakest points in limestone bedrock, dissolves channels, carves chambers, and slowly builds a vertical architecture that bears almost no resemblance to anything on the surface above it. What looks like a hillside from outside becomes underground, a stacked sequence of rooms and corridors, some massive, some barely wide enough to push your shoulders through. The entrance can be modest to the point of deception. A crack, a low overhang, something that looks like nothing. Getting deeper requires the kind of commitment that makes most people turn around. You're not walking through a tunnel. You're squeezing through passages that tighten unexpectedly, dropping through vertical shafts where a rope is the only thing between you and a 40-foot fall, navigating chambers where the floor is wet clay that shifts under your weight. Some sections flood seasonally. The water doesn't announce itself. It rises from below through channels you can't see, and it does it fast. Cavers who work systems like this operate on a strict schedule tied to weather patterns and water tables. Get the timing wrong and the cave becomes a trap. The darkness at that depth is total, not the darkness of a room with the lights off, where your eyes slowly adjust and pick out edges and shapes. Total darkness. The kind that doesn't care how long you've been sitting in it. Your eyes never adjust because there is nothing to adjust to. You're in a place where light has never existed. Not once. Not for a single moment in the entire geological history of the Earth. That alone changes how you think about whatever you eventually find down there. But here's the other side of all the hostility. Caves preserve things. Remarkably, stubbornly, almost impossibly well. The temperature inside a deep cave system stays nearly constant year-round, while the surface swings through summers and winters, ice ages and warm periods. The interior of the rock barely registers the change. That stability matters enormously for organic material. Bone, teeth, organic residue in sediment, all of it decays more slowly in a place where temperature doesn't fluctuate, where moisture stays controlled, where there's no ultraviolet light, no freeze-thaw cycling, no microbes riding in on wind and rainfall. Caves create conditions that the surface world simply can't replicate, and the sediment layers that build up inside them over thousands of years are like a geological filing system. Older material at the bottom, younger material on top, each layer a record of what was happening at a specific moment in time. When archaeologists excavate a cave deposit carefully, they're not just digging up bones and tools, they're reading a sequence. They're moving through time with a trowel, which is why the first hints that something was unusual in this particular system were taken seriously even when they were ambiguous. Local people in the region had stories about the cave, not dramatic legends, more like practical knowledge passed between generations, animals behaving strangely near the entrance, bones showing up in the stream bed that ran near the base of the hill, things that had been washed out from somewhere deeper inside and deposited at the surface after heavy rain. A few of those bones were odd enough that someone kept them. They didn't look like anything native to the area. The proportions were off in ways that were hard to articulate, not wrong exactly, just unfamiliar. There were also mapping anomalies. Early surveys of the cave had documented the upper chambers, but instruments suggested the system continued beyond where explorers had been willing to go. Acoustic surveys picked up spaces deeper in the rock. Ground-penetrating radar indicated voids that didn't connect to any known passage. The cave had more to it. The question was whether whatever was down there was accessible, and whether anything had survived inside it. When a research team finally pushed past the narrow sections that had stopped previous expeditions and reached the deeper chambers, what they found first wasn't dramatic. A few fragments of bone in a disturbed layer near one of the lower passages. Some material embedded in the wall of a secondary chamber that had been sealed by a flowstone deposit. Calcium carbonate that had slowly crystallized over the sediment like a natural vault door. These weren't the kinds of finds that make you shout. They're the kind that make you go very still and very careful, because you know immediately that the context matters as much as the object itself. Here's the distinction that becomes critical in understanding why this matters. A cave that gets used occasionally by humans or animals leaves a certain kind of record. Scattered bones from an animal that dragged prey inside, ash from a single fire, a tool dropped and never retrieved. The deposit is thin, discontinuous, spread randomly across different layers with no particular organization. What you're looking for, when you're trying to understand how a species actually lived, is something different. Repeated use over extended periods. Burned material concentrated in specific spots that indicate deliberate fire management. Bones arranged in patterns that don't match natural deposition. Modified objects in consistent stratigraphic contexts, meaning the same type of behaviour showing up in the same types of layers, across enough time that you can't write it off as coincidence or accident. A cave used as a long-term habitat leaves a fundamentally different signature. The sediment is dense with material. The layers are organised. The evidence accumulates in ways that speak to routine, to return, to an understanding of the space as something more than a temporary shelter. It speaks to something that understood this place, came back to it, maybe depended on it. The deeper chambers of this cave had that second kind of record. Not just evidence of presence, evidence of occupation, evidence that something had been here, repeatedly, deliberately, over a span of time that was going to be very hard to explain. The sealed deposits had protected it from disturbance. The stable temperatures had preserved it. And the total darkness had kept it hidden from everything except the weight of the rock above it. Sitting quietly for longer than any of the researchers standing in that chamber were prepared for. The first real signal wasn't a single object. It never is. Archaeology almost never works like the movies suggest, where someone brushes sediment off a skull and the meaning is immediately obvious. What happened in those deeper chambers was slower and stranger, and ultimately more convincing precisely because it wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. The team had begun careful excavation of a sealed deposit in one of the lower secondary chambers. Flowstone had capped the sediment layer, which meant whatever was underneath had been locked in place for a very long time. When they broke the seal and began working through the material beneath, the first items were fragmentary. Small bone pieces, the kind that could mean almost anything. Animal remains are common in cave deposits. Predators drag prey inside. Scavengers bring carcasses in to feed in safety. Bones wash in from surface runoff and accumulate in natural traps formed by the cave's geometry. The initial finds gave the team nothing definitive to hold on to, but then came the charcoal, not a smear of it. Not a faint trace that could be explained by a single fire set by a passing predator. A concentrated lens of burned material sitting in a discrete layer, bounded on its edges in a way that suggested containment rather than scatter. The shape of it mattered. Natural fires leave irregular burn patterns. A fire that has been built in a specific spot, tended, returned to, leaves a different signature. The carbon was dense at the centre and thinned outward in a pattern consistent with repeated managed burning. A hearth, not just ash. A hearth used more than once by something that understood fire well enough to keep building it in the same place. That's when the pace of the work changed. Not faster, actually slower. Because now the team knew that context was going to be everything, and losing context by moving too quickly would be unforgivable. Around the hearth, and this is what begins to build the case, the bones told a different story than bones in a natural deposit. Some showed cut marks. The kind of precise, repeated lines that a sharp edge leaves when someone is removing meat from bone rather than gnawing it. Stone tools leave a different mark than teeth. The pattern of cuts, their angle, their placement, all of it pointed toward deliberate butchery. Other bones showed evidence of having been cracked open, not by the crushing force of a large predator's jaws, but by a blunt instrument applied to a specific spot, the technique used to extract marrow. Something in this cave had been processing food systematically. Then the pigment appeared, a residue of ochre, iron-rich mineral that produces red and yellow tones, embedded in a crevice near the back of the chamber. Ochre occurs naturally, which meant the team couldn't treat its presence as automatically meaningful. But this particular deposit was concentrated in a way that didn't match natural accumulation patterns, and when they analysed the surrounding sediment more carefully, they found trace smears on the adjacent rock surface. Not painted images, not anything obviously figurative, just marks, repeated application of pigment to stone, which tells you that something was carrying the material and using it deliberately, even if you can't immediately say why. The footprints came from a different chamber, a clay floor that had hardened slowly under conditions that preserved the impressions in remarkable detail. They were bipedal. But the dimensions were wrong in ways that created the first serious pause in the room. The proportions didn't align with modern humans. The arch was different. The toe spread was wider than expected. At first, some team members suggested these might be prints from ancient modern humans with unusual morphology. Other voices in the group proposed they were from a bear walking upright, something that happens rarely but not impossibly. Both explanations were entertained. Neither could be ruled out immediately, which is exactly how responsible science operates. Here's what separates archaeological interpretation from storytelling. A single anomalous object gets checked against every mundane explanation first. You exhaust the ordinary before you allow yourself to consider the extraordinary. A cut mark on a bone? Could be gnawing. A concentration of charcoal? Could be a natural fire event. Pigment on a wall? Could be mineral seepage. Unusual footprints? Could be a deformed bear or preservation artifacts from the clay's expansion and contraction over time. The temptation to leap toward the exciting interpretation is real, and good researchers feel it the same way everyone else does. They just refuse to act on it until the evidence forces their hand. What forced the hand here wasn't any single element. It was the assemblage. And that word carries specific weight in archaeology. An assemblage is the complete collection of evidence from a context. Bones, tools, fire traces, pigments, impressions, spatial organization, all of it read together rather than in isolation. Any one piece of this assemblage was explainable. The combination of all of them in the same stratigraphic layer, concentrated in a way that spoke to organized habitual use of a specific space, was not. The team sat with that discomfort for a long time, because the age estimates coming back from preliminary dating were placing this assemblage in a time window that created a serious problem. Not a problem with the methods, a problem with the existing framework. The date suggested activity in this cave from a period when the humans who were supposed to be in this part of the world were not yet believed to have the behavioral complexity being written in the sediment below their feet. Either the dates were wrong, or the picture of human history in this region needed to be redrawn from scratch. Neither possibility was comfortable. Both had to be taken seriously, and the deeper they dug, the harder it became to argue for the simpler answer. The bones that finally broke the stalemate didn't come out whole. They almost never do. What you get instead are fragments, warped by pressure, stained by minerals, edges rounded by time. Most of them are anonymous, ribs from something, vertebrae from something else. But every once in a while a piece comes out that has a shape you can't mistake if you've spent your life staring at skeletal anatomy. The first of those was part of a jaw, not a complete mandible, nothing you could photograph for a textbook, just a segment with a couple of teeth still locked in place, but it was enough. Because teeth are where human variation and human history both leave some of their clearest fingerprints. Modern human teeth, taken as a group, have a certain look: crown size, root configuration, enamel thickness, the curvature of the dental arcade. There's a range, of course. People differ, populations differ, but the range is well mapped. This jaw fragment was wrong. The molar was big. Not just on the upper end of modern variation, beyond it. The crown was bulbous, lay the cusps arranged in a pattern more at home in a much older lineage. The roots were stout and flared, built for serious chewing, like something that expected a lifetime of grinding down tough, abrasive foods. Yet the bone that held the tooth wasn't a massive, heavy, archaic jaw. It was surprisingly slight. The internal structure, as far as they could tell from the scans, looked gracile, closer to later humans than to anything you'd expect this tooth to belong to. Ancient in the tooth, modernish in the bone. That was the first real anatomical contradiction. Then came a piece of the skull, again not the dramatic movie skull, eye sockets staring back at you from the sediment. Just a vault fragment, part of the cranial curve with sutures that could be mapped and measured. When they ran the metrics, they found another mismatch. The bone was thick, much thicker than typical for modern humans, closer to what you see in mid-Pleistocene hominins, but the curvature suggested a brain case that wasn't tiny, not Neanderthal large, not fully modern either, something in between. A head built for a respectable brain, wrapped in bone that still carried a memory of older, more heavily armoured ancestors. Piece by piece, a pattern started to emerge. A hand bone with joint surfaces suggesting strong, curved fingers, good for powerful grips, but attached to proportions that weren't as long and robust as classic Neanderthal hands. A partial pelvis hinting at a birth canal shape somewhere between early Homo and later humans. Foot bones that, when compared to the prints from the clay floor, made those impressions harder to dismiss as misinterpreted animal tracks. The arch was lower. The toes were more spread. The midfoot looked built for stability on uneven ground, but the overall configuration was still bipedal in a very human way. None of these things on their own would have been extraordinary. Human variation can be surprising. Add in pathology, developmental quirks, the distortions of fossilization, and you can contort almost anything into the tail ends of a bell curve if you're determined to keep it there. What unsettled the team wasn't any single trait. It was the way the traits clustered. If you lined up the measurements against known species, you got a strange result. The teeth wanted to sit with much older humans. The thickness of the cranial bone leaned toward archaic forms that had supposedly vanished long before this cave was in use. Some aspects of the limb proportions overlapped with Neanderthals. Other details of the skull curvature and facial projection overlapped more comfortably with early modern humans. No matter which comparison set you used, some part of the morphology refused to cooperate. This is where the word mosaic starts showing up in the notes. Mosaic evolution isn't a mystery term. It's a way scientists describe a process that we actually know is common. Different parts of an organism's body evolve at different rates, under different pressures. You don't get a clean swap from ancient version to modern version in one step. You get a patchwork, a face that looks old attached to a brain case that looks new. A primitive shoulder on a surprisingly advanced hand. Evolution doesn't repaint the whole canvas at once. It swaps out tiles. What the cave was revealing was a population that looked like a mosaic turned up to 11. In one individual, the dental traits might shout archaic. In another, the wrist bones might look closer to modern. Across the assemblage, you saw a recurring mix. Some features we associate with very early humans, some that overlap with Neanderthals, some nudging toward the anatomy of later Homo sapiens, all jammed together in a single regionally confined group. That raised the obvious question, what were they? The most sensational way to frame it was to say, new species, a human unlike any we'd catalogued before, tucked away in a cave that had preserved their existence like a time capsule. And that phrase did get whispered, because scientists are humans, and humans are drawn to big claims. But in the cold light of the lab, that wasn't the first conclusion they were willing to own. Species in paleoanthropology is a slippery word. It isn't just a label for looks weird. It's supposed to capture something about reproductive isolation, about a line of descent that is headed off on its own trajectory and not mixing freely with its neighbours. Bones alone rarely tell you that story cleanly. They tell you about form. They hint at function. They suggest pedigree. But drawing a bright line and writing new species across it is a serious step. So the team broke the problem down differently. Option 1. These were just anatomically unusual modern humans. A local population with a bunch of strange traits stacked together by chance and drift, still comfortably inside Homo sapiens, just at the edges of what we'd seen before. That was the most conservative interpretation, and conservative interpretations are always the baseline in this kind of work. Option 2. They were a relic population of an already known archaic species, perhaps an offshoot of Homo heidelbergensis that had hung on longer in this region than anyone had expected. Perhaps a hybrid swarm where Neanderthal-like and Denisovan-like genes had mingled with early modern humans, producing an intermediate phenotype that seemed novel only because we'd never caught it in the fossil record. Option 3. They really were something else. A distinct population long separated from other humans, evolving in partial isolation, accumulating their own signature mix of ancient and derived features. Whether that justified calling them a separate species or just a highly distinctive regional group would be a secondary argument. The primary claim would be that they didn't fit neatly into any existing slot. All three options had to be taken seriously. The first, unusual modern humans, meant pushing the limits of known variation. Could Homo sapiens' teeth really get this large, this late, without any obvious pathology? Could cranial bone be this thick in otherwise gracile skulls? Could the foot morphology match those prints without implying a different lineage? To keep this explanation alive, you had to assume that the distributions we'd mapped from thousands of specimens just happened to miss a corner of the map that this cave was now revealing. The second, known archaic hangover, meant stretching timelines and ranges. It would require that some branch of a species thought to have vanished remained alive in this particular landscape, far more recently than models suggested, or that repeated waves of interbreeding among Neanderthal-like, Denisovan-like, and early modern groups produced a stable, local population with its own characteristic look. Possible, not impossible. But it had to be squared with the genetic and archaeological evidence from surrounding regions. The third, distinct population, a possibly distinct species, meant entertaining the idea that human diversity during this period was more layered and more geographically patchy than textbooks currently show. It meant accepting that multiple human forms could have shared territory and time, some leaving strong genetic and fossil signals, others slipping mostly under the radar, known only from a handful of bones in one stubborn cave. To decide between these, the team needed more than measurements. They needed age estimates precise enough to place these individuals in relation to other known populations. They needed to scrutinize every anatomical trait against large comparative databases. They needed to ask whether this mosaic was random noise or a coherent pattern. And they needed to be careful with language. A new species claim is like lighting a flare, as it draws attention, and with attention comes scrutiny, controversy, and if you're wrong, a long legacy of correction. A distinct population claim, on the other hand, is more modest but no less profound. It says, here is a group of humans who are doing their own thing in their own way for a significant period of time. They might still sit inside a broader species definition, but they represent a chapter we didn't know existed. At the outset, the working hypotheses settled into a cautious hierarchy. First, test whether these individuals could plausibly be placed at the edge of known modern human variation. If that failed, see whether their traits overlap strongly enough with Neanderthals, Denisovans, or earlier Homo to treat them as a regional variant. Only if those routes closed off would the team allow themselves to frame them as representatives of a previously unrecognized human lineage. The cave, for its part, wasn't interested in those categories. It had preserved what it preserved, indifferent to our labels. Bones in the dark waiting to be read. The next step was to see whether the extraordinary anatomy was matched by extraordinary behaviour, because if this really was a different kind of human, you wouldn't just expect their bodies to tell a new story, you'd expect their lives to, too. In paleoanthropology, extraordinary anatomy is only the beginning of the argument. Nature can produce strange one-offs, pathologies, developmental anomalies, injuries that heal in odd ways. A cave can mix bones from different times, different species, different catastrophes, and lay them together in the same shallow layer. If you're not careful, you can build an entire new species out of coincidence and bad stratigraphy. So before anyone is allowed to say anything dramatic, the work gets very small and very slow. The first rule is location. When a bone appears, the person who finds it does not just pick it up and hold it to the light like a movie scientist. They call someone over. They talk coordinates. On the floor of the cave, the excavation area has been divided into a grid. Squares, sometimes further subdivided into smaller units, each one with a code. Every square has a known position in three-dimensional space. Every layer within that square is defined by its depth and its relationship to the layers above and below. Stratigraphy is the fancy name for what is, at heart, organized patience. Sediments are laid down over time, floods, roof collapses, slow drips of mineral-rich water. Each event deposits a recognizable signature: color, grain size, mineral content, tiny bits of charcoal. If you cut a clean section through these layers and read them from bottom to top, you're reading time, oldest at the base, youngest at the surface, unless something has disturbed the stack. So the team maps everything. That jaw fragment, it is recorded as coming from square H14, depth 72.3 centimeters, embedded in a reddish silt with charcoal flecks and small limestone clasts. Someone writes down its exact vertical position relative to a fixed reference point, often a metal bolt drilled into the cave wall or ceiling. Someone else notes what lies immediately below and above it: a thin ash lens, a layer of coarser gravel. Another change in colour. Photographs are taken in situ. Only then, once its place in the story has been pinned down, is the fragment carefully lifted. Contamination is the second rule. The modern world leaves fingerprints on everything it touches. Skin cells, sweat, loose hairs, synthetic fibres. For DNA and protein work, those are poison. So inside the cave, the team dresses like a cross between cavers and sterile lab workers. Gloves, masks, hair coverings. Tools are cleaned between uses. Samples for genetic analysis go straight into sterile tubes, never handled with bare skin. Even the air is part of the protocol. In some sites, they test the dust for modern human DNA to estimate the background contamination level. They log who enters and leaves the chamber each day. They track which layers were open to the surface at which times, in case some modern intrusion needs to be accounted for later. It's not paranoia, it's experience. People have been misled before by their own presence ghosting into the data. Documentation is the third rule, and it's the one that makes all the others meaningful. Every bag gets a label. Every label ties back to a set of notes. Those notes live in field books, spreadsheets, databases, cloud backups. Measurements, sketches, descriptions of sediment texture, impressions that seem unimportant at the time but may become crucial when some anomaly appears in the lab. If you ever read primary excavation reports, they are not page-turners. They are relentless. Square, depth, layer, object, orientation, association, over and over. It is that monotony that creates the possibility of trust. Years later, when someone challenges the interpretation, you can go back and say, this bone and that stone tool were not just found together. They were found 5 centimeters apart in the same stratigraphic unit, sealed under a flowstone that we have independently dated, which brings us to time. Bones that look ancient can, in principle, be much younger than they appear. Minerals can stain quickly. Roots can drag material down into older layers. To know what a fossil means, you have to know when it was deposited. Caves complicate this. Light doesn't penetrate, organic material can be scarce, and the usual dating workhorse, radiocarbon, has a built-in expiration date. Radiocarbon dating works on the decay of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope created in the atmosphere and taken up by living things. Once an organism dies, its carbon-14 decays at a predictable rate. There's a measure how much is left, and you can estimate how long it's been since death. But after about 50,000 years, the remaining carbon-14 is so sparse that the signal drowns in the noise. If the cave population lived earlier than that, radiocarbon alone won't save you, so the team layers on other methods. In a limestone cave, one gift you sometimes get is dripstone, stalagmites, stalactites, thin sheets of calcite called flowstones that glue sediments into place. Those are made of calcium carbonate and inside them, tiny traces of uranium. Uranium series dating tracks the decay of uranium isotopes into thorium over time. Because uranium dissolves in water and thorium does not, freshly precipitated calcite starts with uranium but no thorium. As time passes, thorium accumulates. Measure the ratio. See, and you can date when that calcite formed. If a flowstone caps the layer that holds your strange humans, uranium series dating tells you that they must be older than that cap. If a stalagmite grows up through a layer of bones, you can bracket the minimum age of those remains. Then there is the light locked in sand. Optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, doesn't care about bones at all. It dates the last time mineral grains, usually quartz or feldspar, were exposed to sunlight. When they're buried, they start accumulating trapped electrons from background radiation. In the lab, you stimulate them with light and measure the energy they give off. That energy is a clock ticking since the last sun exposure. In caves, OSL can date the moment sediment was washed or blown in, even if there is no organic material. If the odd bones all sit inside a layer whose grains give a similar OSL age, you can be more confident they belong to that time slice, not just random intrusions from above. If teeth are preserved, another clock comes into play, electron spin resonance, or ESR. Tooth enamel traps charges over time as it's bombarded by radiation from surrounding sediments. By measuring the population of trapped electrons and estimating the local radiation dose, ESR can yield an age for when that tooth was buried. Combine ESR with uranium series measurements of the same tooth, and the model sharpens. None of these methods is perfect. Each one has assumptions, sources of error, ways to go wrong. That's why serious claims never rest on a single date. Instead, you get clusters. A radiocarbon age from a bit of charcoal in the same layer, a uranium series age from the flowstone just above, an OSL age from the enclosing sediment, an ESR age from a tooth in the same horizon. If they all point to roughly the same window, within their error bars, confidence grows. If one is wildly off, you start asking why. Contamination, reworking, misassigned sample. While the dating work hums along, taphonomy asks a different set of questions. What actually happened to these bones between life and discovery? Caves are not gentle archives. Water flows in pulses, dragging sediment and carcasses. Carnivores use protected spaces as dens, dragging in prey, chewing, scattering. Humans themselves can move and break bones in ways that mimic natural processes. Under a microscope, a femur shaft full of tooth marks looks different from one broken by a rockfall. The angles and surfaces of fractures can tell you whether the bone snapped while still fresh and greasy or long after, when it had dried and fossilized. Fine linear scratches might be root etching, micro-abrasions from sediment movement, or cut marks from stone tools. Each has its own signature. If your supposed population turns out to be a mixture of hominin, deer, and cave bear bones all chewed and redeposited by hyenas, that undercuts any claim about a distinct group living in that cave. If instead you see repeated patterns of human agency, cut marks, burning, deliberate placement, you can argue that these individuals were deposited as part of some regular behavior, not just random death. Even the way bones are distributed across the grid matters. Are the unusual skull fragments all clustered in one small depression, or scattered through several layers? Do they sit in anatomical partial connection, suggesting bodies decomposed where they fell, or are they disarticulated and sorted by size, the way flowing water tends to arrange things? Taphonomy is the detective work that tells you whether the anatomical mosaic comes from real people or from the cave playing tricks. All of this, the grids, the dates, the fracture analyses, might still only convince the people who were there. To move from interesting find to extraordinary claim, the work has to leave the cave and survive a more abstract environment. Other scientists' skepticism. That's where peer review comes in. Before a major paper is published, it is sent to anonymous experts who had nothing to do with the excavation. They read the methods, they check the statistics. They look for missing comparisons, untested alternatives, overconfident language. They ask whether the sample size justifies the conclusion, whether the dates really support the story, whether the authors have controlled for contamination and taphonomic mixing as thoroughly as they say. Sometimes the verdict is, not yet. Go back, get more dates, expand your comparative data set, tone down the claim from new species to unusual population. Sometimes whole interpretations are dismantled in this stage, long before the public hears about them. When a claim does make it into print, the testing doesn't stop. Other teams will reanalyze the measurements, sometimes from the raw CT scans or 3D models if those are released. Independent labs may redate key samples or apply different models to the same data. In recent years, open data practices have made this faster. Repositories hold bone measurements, stratigraphic logs, even code used for statistical analyses. If someone has overfit a model or cherry-picked a comparison, that trail is visible. Replication in paleoanthropology rarely means finding the exact same thing in another cave. We're not that lucky. It more often means seeing whether the claimed pattern holds up when new fossils turn up elsewhere, or when different methods are applied to the same material. Does another site dated to the same window show similar mosaic anatomy? Do genetic results from nearby regions agree that something unusual was happening in that population? Over time, the web of evidence thickens, or frays. Underneath all of this is a discipline that is, at its best, honest about uncertainty. You'll notice it in the language: estimated age, confidence interval, we infer, consistent with, one possible interpretation. Dates come with plus-minus ranges. Anatomical assignments are given as probabilities, not absolutes. Competing models aren't just mentioned. They are laid out explicitly. If these bones belong to late archaic humans, we would expect X. If they represent a distinct lineage, we would expect Y. Crucially, scientists also specify what would change their minds. If future genetic sequencing from these remains showed clear affinity with known Homo sapiens populations, the new lineage hypothesis would collapse. If re-excavation revealed that the critical bones had slumped down through cracked flowstone from much younger layers, the carefully constructed timeline would need to be torn up. If another site, better preserved and more complete, showed that the same anatomical traits fell comfortably within the range of known variation, once sample sizes were larger, the apparent mosaic might dissolve into noise. Those possibilities don't make the current interpretation meaningless. They give it shape. They say, here is where we stand given the evidence we have, and here are the observations that would push us toward a different stance. In a field built on fragments, that is as close to certainty as you ever get. So when you hear that a group of scientists deep in a cave may have found a kind of human that doesn't slot neatly into any known category, remember the machinery grinding behind that sentence. The grids laid out on a damp floor, the slow slicing of stratigraphic profiles, the lab instruments humming over enamel and calcite, You're coaxing out tiny signals of age. The quiet wars fought in the margins of manuscripts over whether a confidence interval is too wide, a word too strong. Only if a claim can survive all of that does it earn the right to reshape the story. And the story this cave was beginning to suggest, that somewhere in the dark, a different kind of human had learned to live and die and perhaps even thrive, would need every tool in that arsenal to stand. To understand them as people, you have to leave the lab reports for a moment and go back into the dark with them. Imagine the lights go off. Not our LED headlamps, but theirs. Whatever passed for illumination in a world where the sun never reached the chamber where their bones now lie. Caves don't forgive ignorance about fire. Oxygen is limited, smoke has nowhere to go, and a misplaced ember can turn your refuge into a gas chamber. If a group really lived here, not just passing through, the evidence should be written in carbon. Along the walls, in some sections, there are thin, repeated bands of soot. Not a single smoky episode from a forest fire outside, but multiple pulses separated by clean calcite growth. Under the microscope, those particles sort themselves into shapes that match burned wood, burned fat, and something else. Extremely fine, almost oily soot that comes from flames burning hot and clean. That combination tells a story. Wood torches give bright, flickering light and a lot of smoke. Animal fat lamps, basically shallow stone cups filled with fat and a plant fibre wick, burn lower and steadier with a different soot signature. Hot, controlled hearth fires manage to maximise heat and minimise smoke, leave yet another pattern. In some levels, the soot is concentrated on the ceiling along particular bands that trace a path from the entrance inward. Not a random spray, but a repeated route. Someone, over and over, walking this line with a flame held at about the same height. In others, blackening blooms over small low recesses in the walls, niches where lamps might have been set to free up hands. You can reconstruct their lighting technology without ever seeing a lamp intact. Charred twig ends with the bark burned away, but the core still intact look like the remnants of torches that were repeatedly relit and extinguished. Burned bones with polished surfaces, often from long-limbed animals, could have served as fuel when wood was scarce. Bone doesn't catch easily, but once a hot fire is going, it will smoulder and add heat. The distribution of ash, thick in some hollows, almost absent in others, suggests designated fire spots, places where they felt safe letting flames burn for hours. All of that implies fire management skills that go beyond keep it burning. In a cave, you have to know how big a flame you can risk in a given pocket of air. You have to learn which wood smoke least, how to position yourself so the draft pulls fumes away instead of pooling them, when to switch from smoky torches near the entrance to cleaner fat lamps deeper in. That's knowledge you pass on, not reinvent every night. Light shapes where you can live. Follow the densest clusters of soot and ash, and you outline their habitual territory underground. A broad antechamber not far from the entrance, where daylight still seeped in softly. A mid-zone where hearths were dug into slightly elevated patches safe from flooding, and, further in, enter a narrow corridor of black tracing the safest route to the innermost chamber where the human remains accumulate. That last stretch is telling. The walls along it are oddly clean of side soot, as if people hugged a particular line and avoided wandering. On the floor, microscopic wear patterns in the sediment, grains aligned, compacted in repeating streaks, indicate footfalls over the same paths again and again. In some places, small stones have been deliberately set to level out a rough patch, making a more even trail. This isn't a random scramble through darkness. It's a mapped interior landscape, learned by children following adults' footsteps, memorized by feel as much as by sight. Maybe they left subtle tactile markers, scratches at hand height on the wall, a distinctive stone at a branching point, so that even if a flame died, No, you could find your way back to the main chamber rather than vanish into some side tube. Of course, no one eats rock. If they were here for any length of time, food came from outside. The animal bones in the layers associated with them are not just whatever fell into a hole. There are species that prefer open woodland and grassland, others from more tangled forest, a few that usually live near rivers. Cut marks at joints, repeated in similar ways on different skeletons, say these were carcasses they brought in and processed, not random scavenged leftovers. Breakage patterns on long bones, fresh, spiral fractures with percussion scars, show systematic marrow extraction, the kind of behaviour common to many human groups but not to every predator. Tooth wear adds another layer. Under high magnification, mud enamel can look like a landscape. Pits, scratches, polished ridges. In these individuals, the back teeth show heavy microscopic scratching in multiple orientations, the kind associated with diets rich in gritty plant material, roots with sand clinging to them, seeds ground on stone-grinding surfaces, fibrous stems. There are also chemical traces, plant starch granules trapped in dental calculus, mineralized plaque that fossilizes diet at a microscopic scale. Some of those granules match wild grasses, others tuberous plants that grow in damp soils. Taken together, the picture is not of a group that hid in the cave full time, subsisting on cave fish and bats. They were foragers who ranged across the landscape, collecting a broad spectrum of foods, meat, roots, seeds, maybe seasonal fruits, and then carrying choice portions back into the cave to eat, process and share. The cave itself could have offered supplements. In some levels, there are bones from small cavern-dwelling animals with delicate cut marks and signs of roasting, suggesting opportunistic hunting of bats, birds or rodents. Traces of certain minerals on grinding stones hint that they might have scraped wall deposits, salts or clays, and used them either as dietary supplements or for processing hides and plant fibres. Spend enough of your life moving between bright surface and deep shadow, and your body and behaviour start to bend around that rhythm. If most complex tasks, butchering, tool-making, teaching, happened in flickering lamplight, then your daily schedule would synchronize not just to the sun but to fuel availability. Fat from a successful hunt translates directly into hours of light. A bad hunting week doesn't just mean less meat. It means less time for nighttime activities in the cave, more need to rely on daytime at the entrance. That economic link between calories and illumination could shape social roles. Some individuals might specialize in venturing deeper, comfortable and skilled at navigating in semi-darkness, tending long-term hearths, managing smoke. Others might become expert surface foragers, timing trips to distant water sources or nut groves and returning before darkness made the entrance zone dangerous. Children, the elderly, and those with injuries might spend more time near the safest, most illuminated parts of the cave, developing knowledge of its microclimate, its sounds, its small changes. Health would carry the marks of this lifestyle. Long-term cave residence often means reduced exposure to sunlight, and with it, potential vitamin D deficiencies, unless their foraging strategy compensated with vitamin-rich organ meats and fat from animals. Skeletal remains can show indirect signs, subtle changes in bone density, healing patterns in fractures, growth lines that reflect episodes of nutritional stress. Breathing cave air heavy with smoke, day after day, leaves its own traces. Soot particles embedded in the inner surfaces of ribs, changes in the tiny airways of the lungs visible in microscopic bone structure. These are things modern forensic work can sometimes detect. In some deep cave populations, we see elevated respiratory stress markers compared to open-air groups. If those show up here, they're part of the cost of choosing or being forced to live in darkness. Social structure, too, bends to architecture. A cave gives you rooms, constrictions, dead ends. The main chamber's size limits how many bodies can comfortably occupy it. A narrow passage means that moving from the entrance to the inner sanctum is, by definition, single file. That enforces cues, order, deference. The innermost spaces, hardest to reach and most dangerous to light, might become reserved. For certain rituals, for certain age groups, for the dead. In the layers tied to this population, the human bones are not lying everywhere. They cluster in particular recesses, at a distance from the main occupation zone. To reach those spots, you have to traverse the same soot-darkened corridor again and again. That suggests that bringing a body in, or parts of a body, was a deliberate act, a procession into the dark rather than a casual disposal. Living in such a place requires coordination. Someone has to watch the entrance for predators or rival groups. Someone has to keep track of who is deeper inside, who might need help if a torch fails. Communication, verbal, gestural, maybe even with simple sound signals tapped on rock, becomes crucial because you often can't see everyone at once. Over generations, a group that treats the cave as more than a temporary shelter starts to internalize its constraints. Memory becomes spatial, stories pinned not to features of the open landscape but to points underground. When you reach the low ceiling where you have to duck, that's where your grandmother slipped and broke her arm. Past the second hearth, and don't turn right, that passage floods in the rainy season. By the time their bones joined the layers they now occupy, the cave was not just a hole in the ground. It was a structured world with its own rules, its own hazards, its own comforts. The dark was not just an absence of light. It was a learned environment, one they had bent their technology, their diet, their movements, and their social lives to fit. And in adapting so thoroughly to that environment, they left behind the one kind of evidence darkness can't erase. Patterns of soot, of wear, of bone and ash. The traces of a life lived in the shadows, waiting for someone with a grid and a notebook, hundreds of thousands of years later, to read them. If you want to know what kind of minds they had, you stop staring at skulls and start looking at the garbage. The cave floor is full of it. Not in the sense of random junk, but in the sense that every cast-off flake, every broken tip, is a record of a decision somebody made with their hands. Start with a stone. Scattered through the layers associated with this population, there's a particular suite of tools that keep showing up. Not just crude, single-purpose choppers, but a mix of carefully shaped points, elongated blades, and small standardized flakes. The points are the most obvious. Many are symmetrical, thinned toward the base, with edges retouched to a sharp, durable line. Their size and shape put them in a useful range for spear tips, but the details matter. Some have slight shoulders or notches near the base, features that make no sense if you're just holding them in your bare hand, and every bit of sense if you're trying to lash them securely to a shaft. A shouldered point resists twisting. A notch gives your binding something to bite into. That means whoever made them wasn't just thinking about the rock they were holding. They were envisioning the finished composite tool, stone plus wood plus fibre, operating as a single object in some future moment. Thrown into a herd, plunged into an animal, pulled free, repaired. The elongated blades tell a similar story but on a finer scale. These aren't random edges struck off at odd angles. Their narrowness, consistent thickness, and parallel sides suggest deliberate shaping of the core before any flakes were removed. In technical terms, this is blade-based reduction, preparing a stone so it will yield a predictable series of long, usable flakes, and each one ready to become a cutting edge, a scraper, a drill. That kind of planning requires a mental rotation of the stone. You have to see the potential blades hidden inside the core and remove them in the right order without ruining the geometry. It's the difference between hacking away at a log and carefully ripping boards with a grain. Even the smallest flakes are revealing. Many show secondary retouch along one margin, tiny, regular chips removed to straighten and sharpen an edge, while the opposite side is left thick and dull. That creates a tool with a clear business side and a grip side. You can tell which end was held by the absence of microdamage and which part did the work by microscopic wear, polish and striations concentrated along the sharpened margin. This is not mindless napping, it's standardized design. Then there's the stone itself. The cave sits in rock that offers a certain kind of raw material. It's decent but not spectacular. Locally available nodules produce serviceable tools, coarser-grained, a bit unpredictable, fine for rough chopping and simple scrapers. You'd expect a purely opportunistic group to rely almost entirely on whatever they could pry from the cave's immediate surroundings. They didn't. Mixed into the assemblage are tools made from very different stone, fine-grained cherts and silicious rocks that don't occur right at the cave mouth. When you trace the geology of the region, some of these raw materials match outcrops tens of kilometers away, in valleys you can't see from the cave entrance. Two possibilities follow, not mutually exclusive. Either these people were highly mobile, arranging widely over the landscape and bringing good stone home with them, or they were plugged into exchange networks, obtaining distant materials through contact with other groups who lived closer to those outcrops. The pattern hints at strategy. The best materials, those that flake predictably and hold an edge, are preferentially used for weapon tips and fine cutting implements. The local, lower quality stone shows up more often in heavy-duty tools that can tolerate flaws, large scrapers, rough cores, expedient choppers. That kind of selective allocation implies they understood the properties of different stones and reserved the premium stuff for tasks where tool failure could be costly. You don't waste the good chert on something you're going to throw away after one use. You concentrate it where it counts. On the end of a spear you're going to hurl at something that can kick back. Stone wasn't their only medium. Bones in the same layers tell a quieter story of specialization. Some large mammal bones, ribs, long bone shafts, carry narrow, parallel scraping marks that run in uniform directions. These are the signatures of hide working, repetitive strokes to clean flesh and fat off skins, to thin them, to prepare them for drying or softening. In a few cases the hide working tools themselves survive. Long, slender flakes with edges rounded and polished by contact with something soft but resistant, probably skin under tension. Other bones have been deliberately shaped. There are splinters with smoothed, tapered ends, bearing microscopic abrasion consistent with repeated insertion into something fibrous or resistant. Archaeologists call these awls or perforators. You use them to punch holes in leather or plant fibre, to open gaps without splitting the material. The presence of such tools hints at an entire chain operatoire, an extended sequence of actions for making clothing, bags, bindings. You don't bother manufacturing a fine bone awl unless you're routinely sewing or lacing things. Cordage itself rarely survives in deep time, but its ghosts remain. On a few hardened lumps of ancient sediment, and on the underside of some fire-cracked rocks, there are faint impressions, twisted, parallel grooves that run side by side, then cross in repeating patterns. Under magnification, these look like the negative images of twisted plant fibres, perhaps braided or plied together. Combine that with small notches on certain stone tools and polished wear along shaft-like wood fragments, and you start seeing a world of strings and bindings, spear points tied on with fibre, bundles of firewood carried with slings, maybe nets or traps set along game trails and retrieved before nightfall drove them back to the cave. Holding all of this together, literally, were adhesives. Some of the stone points and blade bases preserve thin, dark residues along their proximal ends. Chemical analyses in comparable sites show compounds consistent with plant resins and sometimes mixed with ochre or powdered minerals. The particles here, where they survive, follow the same pattern. Resin smeared where stone would have met wood or bone, sometimes bearing faint impression of fibres pressed into the glue. Adhesive technology is deceptively complex. To produce a usable resin, you have to find the right plants or trees, collect exudates or bark, heat them to the correct temperature, maybe mix them with fillers to change viscosity and strength. Too cold, and the resin stays crumbly. Too hot, and you burn off the useful fractions. Once made, it has to be applied before it sets, while also aligning the parts you're joining. Every step requires knowledge of cause and effect, of sequence and timing. It's chemistry by experience. All of this, stone standardization, hide working, bone tools, cordage, adhesives, points toward a division of labour more subtle than just hunters and gatherers. You can see hints of specialization in the debris. Some napping areas in the cave have dense concentrations of small, well-formed flakes and very few cores, suggesting finishing work. Retouching edges, renewing old tools. Others are dominated by big, early-stage waste flakes and discarded cores, evidence of initial shaping somewhere else, possibly nearer the raw material source, and final refinement back at the cave. Hide-working traces cluster in particular zones, often near hearths, but away from the main circulation paths. That's practical. You want light and warmth when you're scraping a skin for hours, but you don't want people constantly stepping over your work. Bone tool shaping debris may pile in yet another spot. Arrangements like this imply that certain activities tended to happen in certain places, probably at certain times, and possibly under the guidance of individuals who knew how to do them best. Skills like making reliable glue, or twisting consistent cordage, or turning a raw. Stiff hide into something wearable are not intuitively obvious. They're learned practice taught. Then there's the question archaeologists approach gingerly: symbolism. On a handful of bones and pieces of soft rock from these layers, there are marks that don't line up neatly with butchery or tool production. Parallel incisions repeated with similar spacing, cross-hatched patterns that don't follow muscle attachment lines, shallow grooves that start and stop in ways that suggest more than just cutting something open. Do we call this art? That's where caution is necessary. A few parallel lines on a bone could be idle doodling with a sharp tool while you wait for meat to roast. They could be tallies, marks to count something. They could be nothing more than the byproduct of holding a piece of bone steady with one hand while slicing with the other. But patterns help. If the same style of crosshatch, with similar spacing and orientation, recurs on multiple objects, made from different materials, in different levels, the odds rise that you're looking at a shared convention rather than random scratches. There are also fragments of mineral pigments, iron-rich ochres, and perhaps manganese, showing grinding facets and smoothed edges. Pigments can be functional, useful in tanning hides, in adhesives, as insect repellents. They can also be used to colour skin, objects, or surfaces. Without a smear of red on a buried bone or a painted panel on a wall, you can't be sure how they were used, and the responsible answer is, we don't know, still. The combination of possible engravings, prepared pigments, and deliberate treatment of the dead in the same overall context suggest minds at least capable of seeing things as more than purely functional. Whether or not they painted their bodies, they certainly had the tools and materials to do so. Underlying all of this is the environment that wrapped around their lives, a cave that was refuge, workshop, and at times, tomb. Living adjacent to such a space nudges technology in particular directions. Stone points and hafted spears are especially valuable when you can't chase wounded prey for miles. You need to bring down animals efficiently enough that you can haul substantial portions back through twisting passages before predators or heat get to them. Hide working becomes not just useful but essential when your home is damp and chilly. Insulating clothing, ground mats, curtains of skin to partition drafty openings. All of that turns a marginal cave into a habitable, even comfortable space. Cordage and containers matter more when your daily movement is a shuttle between surface and underground. You have to carry water, food, firewood, torches, babies, perhaps bundles of personal items. A people living entirely in the open can drop things anywhere and pick them up later. A people moving along narrow, uneven corridors benefit from bags, slings, nets, anything that frees hands to support and balance. Adhesives and composite tools shine when raw materials are patchy. If good wood is scarce near the cave, you don't discard a broken spear lightly. You bring back the shaft, the tip, and you repair it by lamplight, reusing every piece that can be salvaged. In that sense, the cave isn't just a backdrop. It's an engine of innovation. Its darkness, its dampness, its confined geometry all push for solutions. Better light, better insulation, better ways to connect things and carry things. Over generations, those solutions became traditions, and those traditions left their shadow in stone, bone, and the faintest impressions of twisted fibre. No one piece proves genius on its own, but together, the tools and traces scattered through those layers reveal hands that were confident, systematic, and inventive. Minds that could think ahead, coordinate complex tasks, and maybe, just maybe, see meaning beyond the next meal. To get beyond hints and into something firmer, though, you have to leave the visible artifacts and follow the information that survives inside the bones themselves. Bones are stories in two layers. On the outside, they tell you about lives, what was cut, what was carried, what was broken and healed. On the inside, they carry the record of bodies, ancestry, disease, diet, population history. But that inner record is fragile and time is merciless. If you want DNA, you're not hunting for skeletons. You're hunting for microclimates. DNA is a molecule that hates heat, water, oxygen, and time. It breaks strand by strand until what's left looks less like a book and more like confetti. Every chemical bond is a tiny chance to fail. In a few tens of thousands of years under the wrong conditions, those chances win. Caves sound like they should be perfect vaults. Dark, sheltered, protected from surface weather. Sometimes they are. More often they're slow, wet destroyers. Think about what's happening around those bones in the sediment. Dripping water dissolves minerals from the rock and moves through the layers like a very patient solvent. Seasonal changes send tiny pulses of moisture and temperature through the cave floor. Microbes creep along bone surfaces and into pores, chewing whatever organic material they can reach. Warm, damp caves speed the decay. Fluctuating temperatures crack crystals and open new pathways for water. High oxygen levels feed oxidative damage. Even the chemistry of the surrounding sediment matters. Slightly acidic conditions eat away at bone mineral, opening more internal space to chemical attack. All of this works against DNA. If you're lucky, your cave is cold, dry, and stable. Temperatures that barely move across the year. Little air circulation. Fast burial in fine sediment that blocks microbes and slows water movement. In those rare combinations, DNA can hang on far longer than you'd think. Hundreds of thousands of years in the best high-latitude sites. Tens of thousands in more temperate ones. Our mysterious cave isn't in permafrost. It isn't an ice tunnel. It's a living space that saw fires and bodies, seasons and floods. That means geneticists go in expecting heartbreak, so they start small. Before anyone commits to grinding up a precious bone, they test the environment. They might begin with sediment DNA, extracting genetic fragments directly from handfuls of cave floor without any visible bone at all. This can act like a survey. Which species once bled, shed hair, or defecated here? Sometimes, astonishingly, You can pick up traces of human DNA from layers where no skeleton survives. But sediment is a riot of information. Bats, rodents, plant roots, microbes, later visitors, all mixing. That's where caves are both a blessing and a curse. They concentrate life, but they also churn traces over time. If the sediment hints at something interesting, ancient human mitochondrial signatures, say, then the focus narrows to individual bones and teeth that are morphologically odd or clearly associated with the same layers as the tools and hearths. The cruel twist: the better a bone looks on the outside, the worse it sometimes is on the inside. Dense cortical bone can preserve DNA, but it can also be thoroughly mineralized, its internal spaces filled with new crystals. Teeth often do better. Their inner pulp cavities can act as micro-vaults, sealed off early and protected from water. Petrous bones, the dense parts of the skull that cradle the inner ear, are genetic gold when they exist. In many ancient sites, all the DNA we have from a population comes from a handful of those tiny rocks of bone, so a sample is chosen, a fragment is drilled, powder goes into a tube. Now the real paranoia begins. Ancient DNA labs operate on one constant assumption. Almost everything you're about to see is contamination. Modern human DNA is everywhere. On tools, on gloves, floating in the air. It's easier to amplify, less damaged, and will happily drown out the faint whispers from the past. A single sneeze can ruin weeks of excavation. To fight this, the workspaces look more like clean rooms than crime labs. Positive air pressure, UV lights to break down stray DNA on surfaces, bleach on benches, bleach on instruments, bleach on shoes, separate rooms for pre- and post-PCR work. Researchers wear full bodysuits, masks, double gloves. Ancient samples never share space with modern DNA. And then there are the controls. Empty tubes run alongside sample tubes processed with the same chemicals. Any DNA appearing there is a red flag. Reagent contamination, airborne contamination, lab personnel contamination. But even with all that, you'll never be entirely sure what you're looking at until you see the pattern. Authentic ancient DNA has scars. The fragments are short, often only 30 to 70 base pairs. The ends show characteristic types of damage, cytosine to uracil deaminations, predictable base substitutions that accumulate over time. Coverage across the genome is spotty, with deserts and islands rather than smooth uniform reads. Modern contamination looks fresh. Longer reads, less damage, different statistical signatures at the fragment ends. If most of your sequences are young, and a suspicious number match the genetic profile of the grad student who handled the bones, you toss the dataset and start over. But DNA is not the only way bones speak. Sometimes there just isn't enough genetic material left to stitch together anything coherent. That doesn't mean the trail goes cold. That's where proteins come in. Proteins last longer than DNA. They're built from stronger, more repetitive chemical backbones. And in bones, one in particular dominates: collagen. Collagen is the structural scaffolding of bone. Triple helical strands bundled and cross-linked, mineral crystals embedded between them. As the centuries pile up, collagen breaks down too, but pieces can survive into time depths where DNA is long gone. Proteomics takes advantage of that. You digest surviving proteins from a fossil into short peptides, then run them through a mass spectrometer. The pattern of masses, how heavy each fragment is, forms a kind of fingerprint. Our closely related species have similar collagen fingerprints. More distant species diverge. This collagen fingerprinting, sometimes called zooWEMS, zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, can tell you if a tiny, unidentifiable splinter came from a cow, a deer, or a human. In our cave, it can sort the bone pile, which fragments belong to hunted animals, which to the mysterious hominins themselves. Proteins can go beyond identification. In rare, exceptionally preserved finds, more complex proteomes can hint at physiology, adaptations to cold, for instance, or particular disease markers. They're not as information-dense as DNA, but they push the temporal horizon of molecular biology backward into eras where genomes turn to dust. Even smaller traces survive. Microfossils, pollen grains, phytoliths from plant cells, and microscopic starch granules trapped in dental calculus carry records of diet and environment that nothing else can match. A single grain of starch lodged in ancient plaque can tell you someone chewed a root, or grain that no longer grows anywhere near the cave today. Tiny silica bodies from grasses can reveal the kinds of plants that carpeted the surrounding landscape when the people came and went. Together, DNA, proteins, and microfossils form overlapping nets. Each catches different aspects of the same vanished lives. If the genetic net holds, if you do manage to reconstruct enough ancient DNA from these cave bones, the questions shift. First, who are they to us? You align the ancient sequences against a library of genomes, modern humans from different continents, Neanderthals from Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans from their Siberian and Asian refugees, maybe even more obscure archaic genomes if you're lucky. You look at shared mutations, branching patterns, divergence times. If the cave people sit comfortably on the Homo sapiens branch, just a deeply early offshoot, that's one kind of story. A ghost population of our own species, isolated, maybe specialized to cave life, later swamped genetically by other human groups. If they cluster closer to Neanderthals or Denisovans, or in some strange position between them, the story bends. A side branch that split off during the Great Three-Way Radiation, and then retreated into this subterranean niche, while their cousins roamed the open. If they sit alone, outside all three major branches, closer to us than to anything else, but clearly distinct, that's something else again. An unrecognized human lineage, overlapping in time with us and our cousins, hiding in the genetic noise until a few cave bones brought them to light. But genetics doesn't just tell you where they sit on the tree. It whispers about their whole population, patterns of genetic diversity within their DNA, how heterozygous they are, how many rare variants they carry, how often long stretches of the genome are identical on both chromosomes, give clues to their population size and structure. Lots of long identical segments that suggest inbreeding, small groups, tight circles of mating partners. A richer mix of variants hints at broader networks, more gene flow between bands. Even a fragmented genome can hold signs of past bottlenecks, expansions, and periods of isolation. Coalescent models, mathematical reconstructions of how gene lineages merge back in time, can estimate when their ancestors split from ours, how much interbreeding happened afterward, and whether their numbers ever crashed dangerously low. And interbreeding is its own mine of information. If ancient DNA from the cave people shares distinctive segments with some modern human populations, that means at some point somewhere our ancestors and theirs met and had children. Those segments might be rare, restricted to mountain valleys or island populations. They might be surprisingly widespread, hidden in plain sight in everyone's genome. Those shared pieces can confer functions. High-altitude adaptations from Denisovans show up in Tibetans today. Immune system tweaks from Neanderthal still shape how we respond to infections. If the cave people contributed anything to us, it might live on in subtle advantages or vulnerabilities we haven't yet pinned to their source. Yet even the clearest genomes rarely deliver clean, simple answers. Divergence dates come with wide error bars. Gene flow can blur the boundaries between what we call species. A group that looks genetically distinct in one model may fade into our own variation under another, depending on assumptions about mutation rates and ancient population sizes. you can end up with results that are maddeningly ambiguous. A cave genome that is basal to all known modern humans, a lineage that split early and contributed a little to everyone, or a lot to no one, or a genome that looks like a tangle of ancestry threads, part Neanderthal-like, part Denisovan-like, part unknown. But ambiguity is not failure. It's structure. An ambiguous result tells you the past was messy, that humans didn't segregate into neat, isolated boxes, that lineages split, met again, traded genes, then split once more. That deep in our history, there were more kinds of us walking around at the same time than we see today. For the people of this cave, the molecules that survive, whether long runways of DNA, frayed strands of collagen, or a smear of plant starch in ancient plaque, can't resurrect their language or their stories. They can't tell you what it felt like to huddle by that fire, or whether they whispered myths about the darkness beyond the torchlight. But they can answer questions that stone and bone alone never will. How isolated were they really? How many of them were there? Were they a branch that ended here in this cave, or a thread that we still carry in our blood? And even when they refuse to resolve into a neat label, they still do something profound. They force us to redraw the map of our own family. Because once you know there was another kind of human hiding in the dark, shaped by the same ancient bottleneck, playing its own long game of survival, you have to rethink the timeline that led from those 1,280 survivors to us. And that timeline, when you lay the cave's secrets on top of it, stops being straight. You start with dirt. The floor of a cave looks flat, but in reality it's a stack of time. Each layer of sediment, each thin band of ash or gravel or compacted mud is a snapshot of a world that no longer exists. When archaeologists talk about the layer the bones came from, they're not being poetic. They mean a very specific slice of that stack. A few centimetres that, if you're lucky, represents a few decades. If you're not lucky, it's a jumble laid down over thousands of years, stirred by roots and burrowing animals and later occupants who dug their own pits into older floors. In our cave, the first thing they did was peel that stack apart. At the top, recent history. The faint traces of shepherds, hunters, or curious kids who used the cave in the last few thousand years. Modern trash, disturbed soil, mixed bones of animals we know well, goats, sheep, maybe dogs. That's the noisy surface record. Beneath that, the human past begins to thicken. There's a layer where the artifacts look familiar. Stone tools that fit comfortably within the catalogue of known cultures, maybe a few shards of pottery. Charred seeds that match the beginning of agriculture in the region. Radiocarbon dates slot these occupations into the last 10,000 or 20,000 years. That's the era where we can cross-check the cave against other sites, written history, known climate wiggles. The timeline feels solid here. Go deeper, and the anchors start to thin out. Pottery disappears. Tools become simpler, more generalized. The hearths are still there, blackened patches, charcoal flecks, burned bone fragments, but the people who made them left no names, no inscriptions, only the way they crack stone and butchered animals. Now you're in the territory where radiocarbon starts to fail. After about 50,000 years, the residual carbon-14 is so faint that even the best labs struggle to separate signal from noise. So the timeline shifts to other clocks. Uranium-thorium dating of cave formations, luminescence dating of the sediments themselves, even the decay of tiny crystals shocked by sunlight and heat, the last time those grains were exposed. It's somewhere in these deeper levels that the strange bones appear. They're not lying on the surface of the layer like carefully placed offerings. They're embedded, caught in the matrix of ancient mud and ash. Around them, you might find tools that don't quite fit any known tradition, hearths that look different from the layers above, animal assemblages that suggest a different hunting pattern, a different season of occupation. Each layer that holds them is a separate question. Did the same group use this cave again and again over thousands of years, leaving bones in slightly different depths as the floor rose? Or are you looking at the traces of distinct populations, related maybe, but separated by long stretches of time, where the cave lay empty or belonged to someone else? You can see why the timeline refuses to sit politely in a straight line. The simplest version of the story is this: a long isolated lineage. In this scenario, the earliest appearance of these unusual bones in the cave marks the moment a distinct group first claimed this underground space. They keep coming back. Season after season, generation after generation, they return to the same ledges, the same hearth spots. The layers stack up slowly as their fires deposit ash, as their dropped tools and discarded bones sink into the floor. If the dates from multiple layers, bones, hearth charcoal, surrounding sediment, all cluster within a relatively narrow band separated by, say, a few thousand years at most, it becomes easier to picture a single cultural tradition holding on here. Not static. Nothing in human history is truly static, but continuous enough that you can talk about these people with a straight face. A different version of the story is more fragmented. Repeated occupation. Here the dates from the layers that hold the strange bones are spread out. One cluster at, say, 300,000 years ago, another at 200,000, maybe a third around 150,000. Between them, there are sediments with almost no human traces, or traces that look like a different kind of hominin entirely. The tools change. The animal bones shift from one species mix to another. Pollen and plant microfossils in the sediment tell you the environment swung from dry to wet, cool to warm, back again. In that picture, the cave isn't a permanent home. It's a refuge that different waves of these unusual humans discover, abandon, and rediscover as the world outside surges through climate cycles. They come when conditions push them into this region, when rivers dry up elsewhere or new game herds pass nearby. They disappear when the cave floods, when predators move in, when the surrounding forest or grassland becomes unlivable for whatever niche they occupy. Then there's the most dramatic possibility: a brief but intense episode. Imagine most of the cave's deep history is dull. Sparse traces of animals, a few scattered stones, maybe the occasional visit from some other hominin who left almost nothing behind. Then, compressed into a relatively thin sequence of layers, you find a burst of activity. Multiple hearths, dense clusters of tools, repeated use of specific spaces, and crucially, the majority of the bones that carry this strange anatomy or genetic signal. The dating tells you this all happened during a narrow window, maybe only a few thousand years, maybe even less. Before this episode, almost nothing. After it, the signal of these people fades, replaced by more familiar Neanderthal-like or modern human traces, or by silence. That kind of pattern suggests a group that surged into the area, perhaps pushed by climate, perhaps following prey, perhaps escaping competition, exploited the cave hard for a short time, and then vanished. Extinction, displacement, absorption into another population. The layers don't say how they disappeared, only that they did. To decide between these scenarios, you have to pull the cave's internal timeline out into the wider world. Earth's climate over the last million years is anything but smooth. It's a sawtooth of ice ages and interglacials, long, grinding winters where glaciers expanded and sea levels fell, punctuated by relatively brief warm intervals where forests spread, oceans rose, and deserts sometimes bloomed. We know the rhythm of these swings from ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica, from deep-sea sediments, from the chemistry of stalagmites in caves half a world away. Oxygen isotopes, trapped greenhouse gases, dust layers, all the slow beats of the planet's breathing. When you line up the cave dates against that backdrop, patterns emerge. If the earliest occupation by our mysterious hominins sits at the tail end of a severe glacial period, you might be looking at a group pushed into marginal refuges as their usual habitats shrank. If a later layer with the same bones and similar tools falls within a warm interglacial, maybe they expanded outward again, using the cave as a seasonal stopover on wider migrations. Pollen and phytoliths from the cave sediments fill in the local picture. A dominance of grass pollen, certain types of silica bodies from savanna plants, and the bones of open country herbivores point to a steppe-like environment. A shift toward tree pollen, forest phytoliths and woodland animals tells you the hills outside were cloaked in different vegetation when these people last walked into the darkness. Overlay that ecological map on the genetic and anatomical story, and you can start to see whether this lineage was tracking particular environments, stalking herds across emerging river valleys after ice retreat, or retreating into caves when aridity turned the surface into a dust-blown wasteland. Sometimes the surprise isn't the pattern, it's the date itself. Every so often, a bone from a layer you assumed was one age comes back from the lab with a number that makes everyone sit down. Too old. Too young. Out of sequence with the tools above and below it. Suddenly, the neat migration story you believed last year doesn't quite work. If a fragment with this cave lineage's DNA turns out to be, say, 100,000 years older than the earliest modern human fossils in the region, a door opens. Did this group reach here first? Did they play the role you used to give to Neanderthals or Denisovans in that corridor? You don't have to throw away what you know about those other species. You just have to redraw the arrows on the map. The same thing happens in reverse. A surprisingly young date for a strange skull buried deep in the sequence can mean that this lineage survived much longer than anyone thought, overlapping with our own species not just in abstract evolutionary diagrams, but in real landscapes, real valleys, maybe real contact. But a single shocking number is not enough. Dating is as messy as DNA. Different materials date differently. Charcoal from a hearth might be older than the occupation itself if people were burning ancient wood. Bones can move down through cracks or be dragged up by burrowing animals. Floods can redeposit older sediments above younger ones, flipping the order like a shuffled deck. That's why scientists rarely trust one clock. They layer methods, radiocarbon where it still works, uranium series on the calcite crusts that sealed a layer, luminescence on the quartz grains in the sediment, magnetostratigraphy, the pattern of tiny magnetic reversals frozen in minerals if the sequence reaches far enough back. Each method has its own error bars, its own biases. Overlapping them is like triangulating a signal. When dates conflict, the response isn't to pick a favourite, it's to ask what the conflict is telling you. Did someone sample a disturbed patch of sediment without realising it? Did water move bones vertically through the layers? Is there a reworked lens, material eroded from older deposits upslope and washed into the cave much later? New excavations target undisturbed profiles, looking for cleaner stratigraphy. Micromorphology, thin sections of sediment examined under microscopes, reveals whether the layers were laid down gradually or dumped in sudden events. Bayesian models take all the dates, all the stratigraphic information, and test different temporal scenarios. Which ones fit the data best? Which ones strain the probabilities past breaking? Slowly the mess resolves, not into a single straight line, but into a braided river of occupation pulses and absences. Times when the cave was crowded, times when it echoed only with dripping water. Periods when our strange lineage was present, others when it's absent, and still others when the genetic signals from different human groups overlap in the same layers. The end result isn't a clean timeline pinned neatly on a classroom wall. It's a living, shifting map of possibilities, constrained by physics, chemistry and sediment, but alive with human contingency. And somewhere on that map, our species steps into the picture, not as a sharp, sudden replacement, but as another wavy line threading through the same climatic swings, the same landscapes, the same caves. When you place the arrival of Homo sapiens in this region on top of the cave's layered history, the question stops being when did we get here and becomes who was already waiting in the dark when we arrived. For a long time we told ourselves a simple story. There was before us and us, a ladder. At the bottom, something ape-like, a few intermediate rungs with names like Homo erectus, maybe Neanderthals, standing politely off to one side. At the top, modern humans, fully formed, unique, inevitable. Find a strange bone in a cave and the instinct is to ask, where does it go on the ladder? Is it a new rung, a missing rung, a dead-end rung that breaks off halfway up? But the more caves we open, the less that picture holds. What sites like this are forcing us to admit is that human evolution never looked like a ladder. It looked like a river delta, multiple channels splitting and rejoining, branching off, drying up, cutting new paths, all carrying the same underlying flow. Geneticists sometimes call it a braided stream, and once you've seen it, it's very hard to unsee. Neanderthals, Denisovans, early Homo sapiens, and now these cave people with their odd mix of traits, they're not lined up neatly behind us like ancestors in a family portrait. They're overlapping currents in time and space. They share genes. They share tools. They probably shared fires, stories, and diseases. This doesn't just add another quirky cousin to the family tree. It changes what we mean by family tree in the first place. Because the awkward truth is that human is not a simple category. You can try to define it by anatomy, a particular skull shape, a specific brain size, a chin or no chin, the angle of a hip joint. That works reasonably well when you're sorting clean museum specimens into drawers. It breaks down completely when you're staring at a fragmentary jaw that looks halfway between two boxes no one should have been confident about to begin with. You can try genetics. Does this DNA fall inside the modern human range or outside it? But what does outside mean in a world where Neanderthal DNA makes up a couple % of your own genome if you have European or Asian ancestry, and Denisovan DNA does the same for many people in Oceania and parts of Asia? Set a hard line and you're forced to do something uncomfortable. Declare your own chromosomes human and very similar ones not human, even though you know they once mingled in real bodies, in real communities, through real relationships. Culture seems tempting as the defining line. Maybe human is the species that makes art, buries its dead, uses symbols, plans years into the future. But then Neanderthals start showing up with pigment use, beads, deliberate burials. Denisovan adjacent populations leave hints of complex technology, and now, in this cave, you might have a small-brained lineage arranging space, controlling fire, and producing tools that, if you didn't know their anatomy, you might casually label fully human. So which is it? Bones, genes, or behaviour? The uncomfortable answer is all of them, and none of them alone. When paleoanthropologists argue about whether to call something a new species or a variant of an existing one, they're not just fussing over Latin names, they're wrestling with this messy intersection. If the cave bones are clearly distinct in shape, say, where a different shoulder architecture, a uniquely proportioned hand, and their DNA, if we get it, clusters apart from both Neanderthals and modern humans, you can make a good case for a separate lineage. But if their stone tools look like those of nearby Homo sapiens, if their hearths are organized in similar ways, if they show evidence of similar diets and seasonal movements, the non-human label begins to feel brittle. Because here's something the old ladder story never had to deal with: interbreeding and cultural exchange on a massive scale. The genetic record is brutal on this point. It tells us that whenever two human groups overlapped for long enough, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, Denisovans and both of the others, mysterious archaic populations in Africa and the ancestors of modern Africans, they almost never stayed separate. Yes, they had children. Those children sometimes had enough descendants that their DNA is still with us today. That doesn't mean everyone considered everyone else part of the same people. Social boundaries can be sharp even when biological ones aren't. You can have marriage rules, taboos, prejudices, raiding, kidnap, alliance. All of that leaves barely any direct trace in the fossils. But what it does mean is that whatever psychological line ancient groups drew between us and them often didn't line up with anything a biologist would recognize as a species boundary. Culture muddies things even more. Imagine our cave lineage living for tens of thousands of years within reach of other hominins. Maybe they occasionally met Neanderthal-like groups in shared hunting territories. Maybe later, they met Homo sapiens filtering into the region. You don't have to picture constant contact. A few encounters per generation is enough. A handful of mixed heritage children per century is enough. Every so often, a tool-making trick jumps from one group to another. A way of arranging hearths, a preferred hunting technique, a pigment recipe, a tune, a story. Some things move without genes. Some genes move without much culture. Given enough time, the neat boxes blur. So when we ask, were they human? We might be asking the wrong question. A better set of questions might be, how did they see themselves? Did any other group see them as potential in-laws, or only as rivals, or mostly as myths from the next valley over? If you could sit invisibly by their fire, would anything about the way they talked, laughed, argued, or grieved feel fundamentally alien, or would it feel uncomfortably familiar? We will never have full answers to that. But we can say this: whatever these cave dwellers were, they were not an isolated experiment running in a separate pre-human universe. They were part of the same messy interwoven field of populations that eventually produced us. That's what pushes this kind of discovery close to a paradigm shift. Not because new species found in cave is itself paradigm shattering. That part is almost routine now. Every decade seems to bring another surprise. Homo floresiensis on an Indonesian island, Homo naledi in South Africa, Denisovans reconstructed from a single finger bone and some teeth in Siberia. If the bones in this cave do represent another distinct lineage, it will be exciting, but it won't, by itself, overturn everything. A genuine shift happens if sites like this collectively force us to rethink the underlying model. If we move decisively away from a single line leading to us, to a long period where several different kinds of humans coexisted, interacted, and collectively generated what we now call humanity. If we're compelled to see traits we considered ours emerging multiple times, in multiple lineages, sometimes in parallel, sometimes shared by contact, rather than flowing smoothly up one ancestral pipeline. If we have to admit that key elements of modern human behavior, symbolic thought, complex social structures, maybe even language in something like its full richness, might have roots in groups that are not strictly our species, and that some of those roots run through lineages that went extinct, that would be a deeper change than adding a new name to a branching diagram. It would mean that being human is not a badge pinned to Homo sapiens alone, but a zone of possibility in which several closely related species participated. That our particular branch is the one that survived, not the only one that mattered. It would also clarify what counts as refinement instead of revolution. If this cave's occupants turn out to fall within a known lineage, say, an unusual local form of Neanderthal, or a Denisovan-like group with some unique adaptations, then the story doesn't flip. it bends. We extend a range here, adjust a date there, recognize that a species occupied more environments than we realized, or held on longer than we thought. Those are important corrections. They change maps in textbooks. They tweak models of migration. But they don't force us to throw out the braided stream view. They strengthen it. Each new data point fills in another channel in the river. If, on the other hand, the anatomical oddities hold up, the genetic evidence, if we ever get it, shows long-term separation, and the archaeological context supports a sustained, distinct cultural trajectory, then we might be looking at something more profound, a lineage that sat alongside us, trading genes and maybe ideas for an extended stretch of time, a lineage that complicates any attempt to draw a clean line between our mind and their mind. In that case, the story of being human starts to sound less like the rise of a single chosen species and more like the outcome of a long, crowded experiment in what big-brained primates can become under different conditions. We, Homo sapiens, are one result. Neanderthals were another, Denisovans another, the cave people perhaps yet another. Each tried different ways of solving the same brutal problems: how to feed children through bad winters, how to cooperate and compete, how to remember where the water will be when the rains fail. Most of those solutions didn't lead to a present-day species, but their success or failure still shapes us. We carry genes from some of them. We carry cultural legacies, technologies, patterns of land use that may have originated outside our direct ancestral line. And even where we don't carry anything concrete, we are still part of the same story, written into the same planet-sized experiment. The cave, in other words, doesn't just tell us that someone strange lived here long ago. It tells us that our identity, what we mean when we say we, has always been wider, messier and more entangled than we were comfortable admitting, and it raises a quieter, more unsettling possibility. If this much complexity can hide in one cave, on one hillside, in one region of the world, how much else is still buried, waiting to argue with our sense of uniqueness? Not everyone is ready to rewrite the story on the basis of a few bones from a damp cave. Inside the field, the first reaction to something this odd is almost never, "New species." It's, "Okay, what's wrong with this picture?" Start with the most conservative move, pathology. Maybe these skeletons, or fragments of skeletons, aren't representatives of a whole population at all. Maybe they're outliers. Individuals with developmental disorders, severe nutritional stress, childhood disease that warped growth, injuries that remodeled bone. It's not a crazy idea. We know that rickets, for example, can curve long bones and distort pelvises. Some cranial disorders can thicken bone, shrink brain cases, or change the shape of the face in ways that look startlingly primitive. There are modern people alive today whose skeletons, viewed in isolation, would look like they dropped out of a very ancient chapter of our story. So a serious skeptic will ask, are we sure we're not building a whole new lineage on the basis of a few unlucky individuals? To test that, researchers go hunting for pattern. If you have multiple individuals from the same site, do they all show the same odd mix of traits? Or is each one weird in a different way? Do the left and right sides of a single skeleton match? Or is the asymmetry you'd expect if disease had hit the growth plates unevenly? Are the joints consistent with normal loading over a lifetime? Or do they show the kind of stress you might see in someone compensating for a crooked limb? They'll compare measurements against large data sets of known variation in humans, Neanderthals and other fossils. Plot bone lengths and angles on graphs. Ask whether these cave bones fall outside the range of normal, or just at an unusual edge of it. If pathology can explain everything, if every oddity could plausibly be chalked up to disease, developmental anomaly or trauma, the new species claim starts to wobble. If, on the other hand, the weirdness is consistent across individuals, symmetrical and tuned to function, hips that are odd but clearly built for walking a certain way, hands that are strange but clearly optimized for a specific kind of grip. Then pathology becomes a less comfortable fit. Diseases tend to break bodies in random directions. Evolution tends to make them weird in purposeful ones. The next skeptical move goes even broader. Sample size. How many individuals are we really talking about? Paleoanthropology is notoriously a science of crumbs. A jaw here, 3 teeth there, a partial skull if you're very lucky. It's entirely reasonable to say you can't name a whole new species from half a mandible and a couple of toe bones. And in fact, there's a long-running argument in the field between splitters who are willing to carve out new species on fairly subtle differences, and lumpers who insist that most of those differences fall within normal variation of known groups. Skeptics will point out that living humans vary wildly. Some populations are more robust, others more gracile. Body proportions change with climate. Diet tweaks jaw shape. Lifestyle etches itself into bone. Take a very small, possibly inbred cave-dwelling group with an unusual diet and a rough life history, and you might get skeletons that look distinctive without representing a long, separate evolutionary path. Testing that isn't as clean as running a lab assay. It's more a matter of statistical humility. Researchers will usually hold back from making bold claims if they're dealing with only 1 or 2 partial individuals. They'll focus on describing what they see, comparing it to other fossils, and laying out possibilities. New species, regional variant, pathological individuals. Then they wait, sometimes for decades, for another cave, another hillside to yield more bones that either match the pattern or erase it. Behind all of that is an even more basic question. Are we sure the bones and artifacts we're talking about even belong together? That's the mixing of layers problem. Caves are not filing cabinets. They're active environments. Sediment falls from ceilings, washes in from outside, gets dug up by burrowing animals, disturbed by later human occupants. A single square metre of cave floor can contain material from tens of thousands of years, folded and jumbled by time. If you pull a strange-looking skeleton from one part of a trench and beautiful, sophisticated tools from another, it's very tempting to imagine one individual doing both. But if those tools actually come from a layer a metre above, laid down 10,000 years later, you've just invented a culture that never existed. Skeptics lean hard on this. They'll comb through the excavation records, look at section drawings of the layers, ask how clearly separated the strata were, how carefully they were dug. They might come back to the site with ground-penetrating radar, microstratigraphic sampling, and high-resolution dating techniques trying to reconstruct the cave's history in millimetre slices. In the lab, they'll use methods like micromorphology, looking at sediment under a microscope to see whether layers have been disturbed, and uranium series or optically stimulated luminescence dating right on the rock or soil, cementing bones in place. If different pieces of the supposed new species package turn out to be different ages, belonging to different occupation phases, the integrated story starts to unravel. Finally, there's the plain possibility of misidentification. Teeth, for example, can be treacherous. Some primate molars look surprisingly human under the wrong lighting. Pieces of animal bone can mimic human fragments. Even among hominins, a juvenile of one species can resemble an adult of another. A partial pelvis might be called female when it's actually male, or vice versa. Changing interpretations about childbirth and body size. To test this, bones get passed around like suspect artifacts in a crime lab. CT scans, 3D surface models, and virtual reconstructions let experts from around the world manipulate the material without ever touching the original. Comparative anatomists line up the shapes against huge digital libraries of known specimens. Sometimes initial identifications hold, sometimes they crumble under closer scrutiny. and what was trumpeted as a unique human trait turns out to belong to a large monkey or a badly crushed Neanderthal. All of this nitpicking and second-guessing can sound, from the outside, like an attempt to squash an exciting discovery. From the inside, it's how the field breathes. Every new claim is treated, at least by some colleagues, as a hypothesis to be attacked from every angle. Not because anyone enjoys being a killjoy, but because a mistake at this stage can send a whole research program and a whole public narrative veering off into fantasy. And this is where the media enters, usually at a different speed. A cautious sentence in a technical paper might read, "The assemblage is consistent with," but does not conclusively demonstrate, of the presence of a distinct hominin lineage with a mosaic of archaic and derived traits. By the time it hits headlines, that often becomes "New human species discovered in cave." The words that matter most to scientists, consistent with, does not conclusively demonstrate, possible interpretation, are the first to get shaved off in translation. They don't fit in thumbnails, they don't sell. Meanwhile, internal debates, lively, technical, often unresolved, get flattened into "some experts disagree," as if it were a simple personality clash rather than a process the whole discipline depends on. This distortion cuts both ways. On the one hand, it makes discoveries look more definitive than they are. On the other, when the inevitable revisions come, when a redating shifts the timeline, or a reanalysis downgrades new species to unusual population, it can make science look flaky or dishonest to people who only saw the oversimplified version. Inside paleoanthropology, disagreement is not a scandal, it's the norm. The reason you have 3 different interpretations of the same jawbone at a conference isn't because someone is lying. It's because the data are thin, the stakes are high, and different researchers weigh the same scraps in different ways. One team might be more impressed by the jaw's distinct shape and argue for a new species. Another might see enough overlap with known Neanderthals to fold it into that group. A third might point to the tool assemblage in the layer above and say, "Let's wait until we've sorted out the stratigraphy." Over time, sometimes faster than you'd think, sometimes painfully slowly, evidence accumulates. New sites turn up similar bones. DNA sequences get pulled from previously silent fossils. Dating methods improve and tighten the window of when these creatures lived. Gradually, the wild range of possibilities narrows. So what would really move the needle, one way or the other, for our cave dwellers? On the "yes, this is truly a distinct lineage" side, several things would help. First, replication. Finding more individuals in the same site and in different sites that show the same suite of traits. Not just one odd skull, but a pattern of anatomy. Skulls, jaws, limbs that repeats across multiple caves and multiple time slices. Second, clean context. Clear, undisturbed layers showing that the bones, tools and hearths you're associating really do belong to the same occupation. Tight dating that places this lineage in a specific window of time, distinct from other known groups in the region. Third, genetic or proteomic separation. Ancient DNA would be ideal, though it's fragile and rarely survives in warm caves. Failing that, ancient proteins can sometimes preserve enough of a molecular fingerprint to tell you whether this population branched off early from the Neanderthal Denisovan Homo sapiens cluster, or whether it nests comfortably inside one of those. Finally, evidence of a sustained cultural trajectory. If, over thousands of years, this group's tools, habits, and perhaps even use of space show a consistent pattern that isn't simply borrowed wholesale from neighbours, that strengthens the case that you're dealing with a population with its own deep history, not just a local variant passing through. On the "no, this doesn't warrant a new species" side, the decisive evidence would look different. If new finds expand the range of known Neanderthal or Homo sapiens variation until these cave bones fall neatly inside it, that undercuts their uniqueness. If better dating shows that the bones and the advanced tools aren't actually from the same phase, that the odd anatomy belongs to a much older, more archaic population, and the fancy artifacts to later visitors, that decouples biology from behaviour. If genetic or protein data, when they finally come, drop this lineage squarely within an existing branch with no sign of long-term isolation, the rationale for a separate species name collapses. At that point, the story shifts from unknown human to known human doing something we didn't expect in this place at this time. Either way, the discovery matters. In one scenario, we add a new current to the braided river of humanity, another lineage that helps shape our world before vanishing. In the other, we stretch and complicate the currents we already knew about, learning that Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens were more flexible, more diverse, more surprising than our tidy diagram suggested. What the debates, doubts, and alternate explanations really tell us is not that we know less than we thought, but that we're finally starting to ask questions big enough that a single cave, a single skeleton, can't answer them alone. Which leaves one more question hanging in the dark. If this lineage did exist, if these people really walked out of that cave day after day for thousands of years, what happened to them? Maybe nothing dramatic at all. Or maybe that's the hardest possibility to wrap our minds around, that a whole branch of humanity could live, struggle, love, raise children, bury their dead, and then just fade. No heroic last stand, no single cataclysm, just the slow arithmetic of small numbers in a big changing world. To understand how that could happen, you have to picture what it means to be a cave people in the first place. Not cartoon cavemen who live entirely underground, but a population for whom a handful of caves are the stable anchors in an unstable landscape. Deep shelters that stay cool when the outside world bakes, dry when the rains turn everything else to mud, defensible when predators or rivals get too close. The kind of place that, from the outside, might look like nothing at all. Remote caves are often tucked into awkward folds of topography, up sheer limestone cliffs, behind tumbled boulder fields, halfway along escarpments with no obvious path. If you're not born into the knowledge of where they are and how to reach them, you could walk within a kilometre for your entire life and never know they existed. Layer on ecology, and the invisibility becomes almost guaranteed. Imagine a valley whose main resources are seasonal, herds that pass through for only a few weeks, fruit that ripens all at once and then is gone, rivers that swell and shrink, making some routes impassable half the year. In that world, mobility is the default. Most groups roam. They leave ephemeral traces, campsites that vanish in a season, hearths washed away by floods. A cave-based group is the opposite of that. They're the ones who know that if you follow that narrow ravine that looks like a dead end, and then scramble up the hidden ledge, and then squeeze through the crack that smells of bat guano, you emerge into a cathedral of stone with a flat, dry floor and a chimney that pulls smoke away. They're the ones who've mapped, in song and story and muscle memory, a three-dimensional puzzle no outsider ever sees. If they're small, 20, 30 people at a time, and if they practice tight territoriality around those key refugees, the window for contact with other humans shrinks. You might only cross paths at the periphery, at a hunting ground, a waterhole, a berry patch at the edge of their range. You see a flash of movement in the trees, a set of footprints at the riverbank, a discarded tool with a surprising design. Something uncanny. We're close enough to recognize as human, far enough to register as not us. Under those conditions, actual social mixing can stay minimal for a very long time. It's not that they're literally invisible, it's that the cost of trying to find their heartland outweighs the benefit. Why risk climbing unknown cliffs and navigating unknown rocks when there's easier prey and safer water in the next valley over? Why push into the shadow of a ridge that local stories already say is owned by people who don't talk, don't share, don't marry out. You start to see how, in a continent teeming with other hominins, a cave-adapted group could remain a thread running parallel to the main tapestry, rather than woven right into it. And threads like that, even when they're thin, can leave echoes. One place those echoes might survive is in stories. This is where things get delicate. For a long time, science treated oral traditions and folklore as colourful but unreliable. Nice for background, irrelevant for hard data. That assumption has been quietly eroding. We now know that some Aboriginal Australian songlines encode real coastal geography from before sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. Pacific navigation chants preserve accurate knowledge of currents and star patterns across thousands of kilometres. In parts of Europe and Asia, myths about stone rain line up eerily well with known meteor impacts. So when local communities around a newly famous cave say, "We've always known this place was different," it's worth listening. You find recurring motifs in mythologies from all over the world. Small people in the hills, wild people in the caves, other nightwalkers who steal food but avoid open confrontation, beings that are human-shaped but not quite human in behaviour. They're given names that translate awkwardly into English: forest grandfathers, mountain children, the quiet ones, the inside people. It's tempting to draw a straight line. Ancient cave population to modern legends about hidden folk. We have to resist that temptation, or at least label it clearly when we're indulging it. Stories are layered things. They pick up fragments of memory, moral lessons, and pure invention. Then they get retold in forms that fit the needs of each generation. A tale about people in the hills who don't speak our language might start as an encounter with a neighbouring tribe and, over centuries, accumulate supernatural elements until it bears little resemblance to its origin. But dismissing those stories entirely is its own kind of mistake. What responsible researchers try to do now is more like triangulation. They don't say, "This legend proves that a separate human species lived here." They say, "It's interesting that detailed stories about cave-dwelling others persist in this region, and that the motifs are consistent across unrelated groups. We should at least note that, alongside the bones and tools." Crucially, they do this by involving the people who own those stories. Which brings us to the ethics. When we talk about a new species in a cave, it can sound abstract, almost like we're discussing a rare beetle. But real human remains are not just data points. They're ancestors, if not of any living biological lineage, then of cultural landscapes and communities whose roots go deep into that ground. Whose bones are these in a moral sense? In many countries now, you can't answer that question with the scientists and call it a day. Indigenous groups, local villages, regional governments all have claims and obligations. They have their own systems for dealing with the dead, their own ideas about what's respectful and what's desecration. Should the skeletons stay in a distant capital city museum or in a local centre? Should they be reburied after study or preserved for future technologies that might extract more information? Who decides which questions are worth asking? Which tests justify further disturbance? Then there's the question of narrative ownership. When a striking discovery hits the news, the first voices most people hear are not the elders who grew up hearing "Don't go to that hill," and that's the inside people's place. They're the principal investigators, the big institutions, the documentary narrators, the people with platforms. Responsible storytelling means pausing before we spin these cave dwellers into whatever archetype fits our current cultural mood. Noble primitives, tragic relics, savage others, mystical in-betweens. It means asking who benefits from a particular framing. It means letting local perspectives shape not just the logistics of excavation, but the very questions being asked of the site. That care extends forward in time too, because this cave is unlikely to be the last word. If anything, it's a starting point. Future fieldwork might push further into the darkness literally. Many caves that have been partially explored still hide side passages sealed by rockfalls, choke points, or simple fear. New technologies are making those spaces more accessible. Miniature robots and ground-penetrating radar can map voids behind apparently solid walls. Micro-drilling can sample sediments from unexplored chambers without opening them up fully, and you don't always need more bones to learn more about the people who left them. Sediment D. Na is one of the quiet revolutions in this field. Even if no visible remains survive, tiny fragments of genetic material can linger in the cave floor, shed from skin cells, urine, feces, decomposed bodies long since turned to dust. By extracting and amplifying these traces from different layers, researchers can build a timeline of who used the cave when: humans, other hominins, animals. A handful of successful studies have already found Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA in sediments with no bones at all. If the same techniques work here, we might be able to trace the rise and fall of this cave population over tens of thousands of years, watch them appear, persist, and maybe dwindle, all in the fine-grained record of dirt. Beyond one cave, broader surveys could change the scale of the story. Once you know what to look for, particular tool styles, specific ways of arranging hearths, characteristic traces of fire use, you can revisit old excavations and new sites with fresh eyes. Sediment cores taken from nearby rock shelters, overhangs and open-air sites might reveal the same genetic signatures. A pattern could emerge, not an isolated dot on the map, but a constellation of refuges linked by seasonal movements and kinship ties. Or the opposite could happen. We might discover that this cave really was an outlier, a last holdout of a lineage already thinned to almost nothing, surviving in one pocket while the rest of its kind had disappeared. A population whose very success at staying hidden, hugging the underground, avoiding contact, relying on ultra-local resources, eventually boxed them into a corner they couldn't escape when conditions shifted just enough. In either scenario, some questions will remain stubbornly unanswered. We'll probably never know what they called themselves, what stories they told their children about the time before the cave, what they thought the stars were, or how they explained death. We can measure their bones, model their gait, analyze their diet from isotopes in their teeth. We can infer their group size from hearth patterns and their hunting strategies from cut marks on bones. But the experience of being them, the feel of cold stone under bare feet, the sound of voices echoing off the chamber walls, the emotional weight of carrying a body into the back of the cave for burial, will stay, to some extent, beyond our reach. And maybe that's appropriate. Because in the end, the most honest thing we can say about this hidden people is that they were real. They were us in all the ways that matter, and yet they remain partly unknowable. A branch of our family that slipped into the dark corridors of time and left only scattered traces for us to puzzle over. Those traces are enough to tell us that our story has more twist than we imagined. They're not enough to close the book. We're left standing at the cave mouth in our minds, looking into the blackness where their voices once bounced from stone to stone. Aware that there is more in there than we can see. Not just bones and ash and DNA, but the simple, astonishing fact that for a while, in that hidden space, another way of being human flourished. And then, without fanfare, it was gone, leaving behind echoes we're only just starting to hear. So what do we do with that? We stand here with a handful of solid things and a universe of maybes. The solid things first. There really was a time when our genus was a tangle of branches, not a single clean line marching toward us. There really were populations that lived at the edges of maps, genetically distinct, behaviourally specialised, occupying niches we barely knew existed. Some of them, like Neanderthals and Denisovans, are now part of standard human origins lore. Others, like this cave lineage, are still half in shadow. We know that caves can act as time capsules. Bones, tools, soot, pollen, DNA fragments in the dirt. Taken together, they show us that humans and near-humans have experimented with more ways of living than our schoolbook diagrams ever suggested. We know that genetic bottlenecks, climate swings, and sheer luck have shaped who made it through and who didn't. And we know that every person alive today carries echoes of that wild branching past, both in our bodies and in the cultural instincts we inherit. Those are the anchors. Around them swirl the questions that won't sit still. Was this cave population a truly separate species, or an isolated, highly specialized group of ordinary humans who just happened to fall off the main genealogical highway? Were they the last representatives of a much older radiation, hanging on in underground refuges long after their cousins vanished from the surface? How often did they actually meet and mix with other humans, and how much of them, if any, still lingers in genomes we haven't sampled yet? Did they leave a faint fingerprint in the myths about inside people and hill folk and quiet ones? Or are we projecting our hunger for connection onto stories that evolved for other reasons entirely? Even the basic timeline is slippery. A few more dates, a new round of sediment DNA, a single well-preserved skeleton from a neighbouring valley. Any of those could shift the narrative from hidden sister species to forgotten community, or back again. The science here is not a monument. It's scaffolding. It's meant to move as new pieces slot into place, but whatever the final labels, the core message this cave presses on us is the same. Our story as a species was never a straight arrow. It's a river forced through narrow channels, splitting, rejoining, disappearing underground, resurfacing miles away. It's side branches that flourish briefly and vanish, leaving only a change in the current and a few strange pebbles on the riverbed. For a long time, we told the human journey as if it were obvious and inevitable. Apes, early humans, us. This cave says otherwise. It says there were other ways of being human that worked. For a while. Other minds that solved the problems of fire, safety, hunger, kinship in ways we're only beginning to glimpse. Other experiments in language, ritual, technology that didn't lead here, but were no less real for ending where they did. What we do with that, ultimately, is up to us. We can treat it as trivia, another odd headline about mystery humans and strange skulls, or we can let it change how we think about ourselves, less as the pinnacle of a ladder, more as the latest configuration in a long series of improvisations. Not inevitable, not guaranteed, but contingent, precarious, and deeply connected to lives that left almost nothing behind. And this is where you come in. Because the story doesn't just live in journals and excavation reports, it lives in the conversations we have about what it means. I'd love to hear your read on this cave people. Do you lean towards separate species, lost cousins, or weirder than both? What part of their world does your mind keep circling back to? The darkness, the secrecy, the ordinary days we'll never quite reconstruct? And tell me in the comments what you think. And tell me where you're listening from. One of the joys of making these deep time journeys is knowing they're being heard from apartments and farmhouses and dorm rooms and night shift break rooms all over the planet that these ancient humans never saw. If you'd like to wander further down this tunnel of prehistory, I've put together a whole book of stories just like this, about forgotten lineages, lost coastlines, near extinctions, and the strange, fragile luck that led to us. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. And if you want more explorations of hidden chapters in our past, it genuinely helps to tap like, leave a comment and subscribe. That tells the algorithm there's an audience for slow, careful journeys into the deep past. Not just quick takes and simple answers. Somewhere, under some other ridge, there are still caves no one has opened in tens or hundreds of thousands of years. Bones waiting in the dark. ash from fires that warmed hands like ours. We don't know yet what those places will reveal. What we do know is that every time we add another hidden people to the story, the picture of us gets a little less tidy and a lot more true.